Hey guys, welcome to chapter 3. So, last week we kind of attacked supply and demand, right? There were lots of equations, you learned to solve for equilibrium and invert your curves and all kinds of stuff. Hopefully, that all made sense. If not, it's time to get help. Put questions up on the discussion forums and get help. Or, don't forget, you can always set up an appointment to talk with me. Because, yeah, you're going to need this stuff even more. Because this chapter, we're still in supply and demand. Only now we're going to use it and we're going to throw in a lot more moving pieces. You may remember from principles, we talked about price floors and price ceilings and quotas. Well, guess what? We're going to add price floors, price ceilings, and quotas. With that comes a discussion of consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss. These words ringing any bells, I hope. If not, that's okay. We can learn it again. We're also going to add 2 new market interventions that we never did before. We're going to add a per unit tax and a per unit subsidy, which is just a negative tax. So you have to be familiar enough with the supply and demand framework that working through those equations, it's not a big deal to then add moving parts, like a price floor that forces a surplus, or a price ceiling that forces a shortage, or a quota that just keeps us out of equilibrium altogether, or a tax that pushes us away from the equilibrium quantity. Stuff like that we're going to be able to quantify with our model. So in this video, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to remind you of a couple of things. Overviewing. There's not going to be much technical content in this video. There's plenty of that in the rest of this week's playlist. Alright? So as you're watching this, remember this is a reminder. I'm also going to dig into the tax a little bit. I might get a little technical there. Everything else will just be kind of review. Alright, so let's start with consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is a measure of consumers' extra willingness to pay, right? The demand curve measures the most we're willing to pay at any given quantity, and the height of the demand curve says how much we're willing to pay. If the price is below that, then that gap is just money I was willing to spend and I didn't have to. The more of that I have, the better. Consumer surplus is dollars left in consumers' pockets for every transaction they had, and the more of it we have, the happier the consumer. Now, I'm not trying to make a big philosophical statement about money buying happiness. I am using a measuring stick that is easily quantifiable. Dollars. And in general, if consumers can choose between having the same number of goods and lots of money left over versus the same number of goods and no money left over, you'd rather have lots of money, right? I don't know many people who that's not true, if any. Anyway, producer surplus, similar. It's the gap between marginal costs and price. It's related to profit, it just ignores fixed costs. We'll dig into that a lot in chapter 7, what those differences mean. But for now, producer surplus is a lot like profit. More of it, the better. Okay? The more price is higher than the supply curve, which measures our cost of production at any given quantity, the bigger that gap, the happier our firms are. Now, you may remember from principles that in equilibrium, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus combined are maximized in equilibrium. And the greatest total surplus is when a market is allowed to function. When a well-functioning market, an actual competitive market, is left to its own, shortages will go away as prices rise, surpluses will go away as prices fall, And the number of transactions will be maximized, and the total surplus will be maximized. Sweet. Technically, that's called the first fundamental welfare theorem of economics. It's a lot mathier than that, but that's the gist of it. The book doesn't call it that, so who cares? But it's a thing, man. Competitive markets, equilibrium is the best outcome for the overall big picture for society, the most total surplus. That market's generated the most dollars of well-being. So this chapter, we're going to look at 5 ways we can screw that up, and some of the reasons why we might want to do that, right? So we have price controls, price floors and price ceilings. Those are 2 of the ways. Now you might remember price floors. Okay? A price floor is some sort of minimum price. So a common one is minimum wage. Now, if minimum wage is above the market price, it's going to lift the price up. High prices, that's going to lead to a surplus, right? Yeah, it leads to a surplus. And that means that fewer people are going to get jobs, assuming it's a competitive market, because the demand will be lower. Not the demand. The quantity demanded will be lower. That's okay. If that's what you want. I'm not making a big statement that minimum wage is good or bad, but I'm just saying that if it pushes the price high, it probably will kill some jobs, depending on the structure of the market. Side note, some markets are not competitive. If you're interested, I can show you some pretty cool research on different labor markets where things get a little backwards, where firms were using market power to push for lower prices, and when a local government raised the minimum wage, it actually corrected this market failure and made the market more competitive and actually increased the number of workers. Pretty crazy. It's not the default setting, but there are exceptions to the generic high prices, lower quantity. Anyway, minimum wage causes, so price floors, higher prices cause surpluses. We do those to benefit the sellers at the expense of the buyers, and the result will be sellers gain, buyers lose, and some sellers actually lose too because they just don't get a job. Price ceilings work the opposite way, some sort of maximum price. Now I want to share an example of something recent going on. The Senate just passed this inflation bill. Now, I'm not going to dig into the politics of it, okay? Conservatives hate it, liberals like it, whatever. Okay? I'm not digging into that. But I do want to say part of this inflation bill is that it is to help Americans with high drug costs. Okay? That is probably a pretty good example of a price ceiling. Now, when you get to our technical videos on price ceilings, take a look at what those do. If the market's competitive, a price ceiling will cause a shortage of the good. Now, I will say that the pharmaceutical market is not a competitive market. It's something more like an oligopoly, where firms charge prices above marginal cost, and we're not at the Q star, P star outcome anyway. This could actually be something that makes it more efficient, but whatever. I'm just using it as an example to tell you what a price ceiling is. Now, we've also done quotas. I made a pretty interesting video about quotas using taxi cabs. I think you'll think it's interesting. But it's a maximum quantity in a market. It's a limit on how many transactions are allowed to happen. And if there's a low number of transactions, but people are willing to pay a lot for them, they're going to bid up so that they get the limited number. Pretty crazy stuff with the taxis. Got to check it out. Now, two new ones. One of them are taxes. Okay, in the state of Texas, there's a 6.25% tax applied to all alcohol, and in some places, and also an extra 2%. There's an 8.25% tax rate imposed on mixed beverages. Okay, the government's taxing a good. Now, if you don't buy the good, you won't pay this tax. But every time you buy one, you're going to pay the tax per unit. We do the same thing with gas. In Texas, it's 20 cents per gallon. Now, I'm in Washington State right now, and our gas prices are higher than yours. One reason for this, not the only reason, one reason for this is our gas tax is 49 cents a gallon, 2.5 times what yours is. So right there, that adds an extra 29.4 cents on every gallon just as a tax. So what do you think that this tax does to the quantity we buy? Well, if you add 49 cents to the price, or 20 cents if you're in Texas, or 6% if you're talking alcohol instead of gas, whatever. But if you raise the price, what's that do to the quantity demanded? Decreases it, right? Yeah. So it's probably going to be something that makes it so less transactions happen, because the government is taking money out of the market, and so fewer transactions are going to be there. Now, the funny thing, though, is the tax doesn't cause a shortage, or demanders want to buy less and sellers want to sell more. It just decreases both the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. It creates like a wedge between the supply curve and the demand curve, where like there was this price coming along the demand curve way up here, and there's a price on the supply curve down here, and usually we're going to shift along the curves until they touch each other at the X. But in this case, the government's pulling money out first, and so once they're 49 cents away from each other, or 20 cents away from each other, the price that sellers are paying will be different from the price sellers are receiving by the amount of the tax. But the seller price plus the tax will equal the buyer price, and that's about as close to equilibrium as we can get. So check out the tax video. I dig into that quite a bit. But the gist of it is there's going to be fewer transactions, and the government gets some of the surplus in tax revenue. Because don't forget, consumer surplus and producer surplus are both measured in dollars. So the government can take that as revenue. So consumers and producers will both lose. Who loses more depends on who's more elastic. The inelastic side, or relatively inelastic side, will always pay a bigger part of the tax. If you've got a really steep curve, you'll see it in the drawings, my friend. You'll see it. But the burden of the tax will fall on the inelastic people, the steeper curves. Draw it if you don't believe me, or check out the videos. I cover it there. Now, let's also talk about subsidies. I put this picture behind me because I've never talked about subsidies in my classes before. Solar panels. Solar panels are actually subsidized in a lot of places. In the state of Texas, for instance, you can cash in on this. I mean, I guess any state, there's like a federal tax credit or whatever, where the government like basically spots you with a tax credit for the entire installation cost. And then you take out this loan to pay for like the panels themselves, but they spread the loan out over 20 years. And so your payment is usually less than your actual electric use. And so like, it's literally cheaper to get them than not to. So if you're planning to stay in your house for a long time in Texas, it's kind of a no-brainer. You should get them. So let's talk about what that means. just from like a supply and demand standpoint. A subsidy is when you throw money into a market. It's the opposite of a tax. Instead of taking money out of every sale, it's putting money in every sale. Instead of taking money out and saying, hey, the sellers are not going to receive every penny and the buyers are going to pay something, we're going to take some, the sellers don't get as much. That's going to restrict activity. This is the opposite. This is the government throwing money into the transaction so that there are more people who are willing to pay enough to make it worth the seller's time. And so this actually can increase production past equilibrium because people who valued the goods less than costs will now have their value plus the subsidy might be able to match the costs. And so they're going to buy things that they wouldn't buy if the government weren't throwing money at them. So subsidies are going to help buyer and seller, but there is going to be some sort of a loss because ultimately the government is losing a ton of money on this. And the amount that the government has to pay outweighs the gains to the buyer and seller. Yeah, some interesting stuff. Now, why do we do things like this? I started the lecture by saying in a competitive market, equilibrium is efficient and maximizes total surplus. And all 5 of these create deadweight loss, where the market's literally creating more surplus for society if you leave it alone. So why would we do it anyway? Well, there's a few reasons. One, it could be you're in a competitive market, but politicians have picked a side. Right? Maybe the people who want higher minimum wage have collectively bargained to a point that politicians are taking their side and saying, hey, let's give you a minimum wage, we got your back. Or maybe with a, I don't know, let's do a quota thing. Maybe like with those taxi cabs, you have to watch the video, but the gist of it is, in places like New York City, they issue a certain number of licenses to drive taxis. People want to buy a lot more than the city issues. The city only issues some because they don't want the roads being too congested. And as a result, the price of them is really high. People make a ton of money driving taxis. But why do they do something like that? Well, it's ultimately going to benefit the taxi. Because at least for the ones who are in business, they make a lot of money. If we were doing an in-person lecture, there'd be a whole lot of side notes to dig into about occupational licensure and regulations. A lot of times, it's the people who are in business who want their business to be regulated. For instance, I keep mentioning taxis. Well, Uber and Lyft are like taxi slayers, right? It's an app on your phone that can get someone to show up and give you a ride. So you don't need a taxi. It used to be taxis were like the only people doing their thing, but now Uber and Lyft are mooching on their business. And so there are lots of places where there are some places where the local taxi companies are working with the government to try to ban Uber and Lyft, or at least to restrict them or subject them to the same regulation. Sometimes it's the businesses who are in business who really want these quotas or other restrictions to limit their market because it raises their producer surplus, which is like their profit. It's kind of interesting. That's a tangent you can really get me going on. So let's just say. We're talking about hairstylists too. But anyway, it's for another day. Let's see. And then the taxes, the subsidies, same idea. It could be you're in a competitive market, but the government just decides, hey, we're going to help our friends or hurt our enemies. So those are like the cynical ones. Those are the cynical excuses. The market's great and the government's just like, hey, we like this person more than that person. Other options, there's a lot of options, but let me give one more different version, is a lot of markets simply aren't competitive. The pharmaceutical market, for instance, is not competitive. Are there so many sellers that none of them control price? No. There's a couple of sellers, and they absolutely control their price. Are they all selling identical goods? No. They have patents protecting their goods so that no one else can copy them. That market is not competitive, not by a faint breeze or a storm wind. It's just not. And so it's possible that the price ceiling in that market is correcting a market failure and making the market closer to what should be in equilibrium. Maybe. We'll dig into some ideas in chapter 17, some concepts of market failure, because it's possible if a market's not efficient, that some sort of corrective action can actually make it better. I'm not saying every corrective action works, but I'm saying it's possible that some would help. Third option is our politicians. They might not have efficiency as their primary goal. Right? This is related to them picking favorites, but just the idea of maximizing dollars isn't usually a very good political platform. There's usually some sort of extra goal. Right? For one politician, it's protecting a certain group. For another politician, it's promoting a certain right. I mean, who knows? So lots of reasons why we do these things. I don't know. For the technical videos, check them out. There's lots of math. There's lots of working this stuff out. I hope it's helpful. I hope this overview kind of gives you some of the big picture items. But yeah, good luck, guys. Happy econing. Oh yeah, don't forget to use the discussion forums. I'm guessing a lot of you are going to need it because this chapter is kind of hard. Peace.